What up? So today we're here at East Perth. We're at the Whipper Snapper Distillery in East Perth. So we're going to do a little bit of a non-drinkers whiskey tour. Okay, so that's $20 a head. If you pay $40 a head, you can get a tasting of 3 different liquors, which is equivalent of 1.5 standard drinks. So let's see how that goes. Welcome back to the channel, guys. So today we're at Whipper Snapper Distillery in East Perth. We're going to go in and do a non-drinking whiskey tour, but you can do one that gives you a sample taste of, I think, 3 different liquors. It's like $40 per person. We're just doing the $20 one today, so it's just for the non-drinkers. Let's go in and have a look.
Otherwise, you have to like every single place in the world you travel, day through.
Doesn't like. No liking.
Coming over for a pat.
Hello.
Coming over for a pat.
You're fine? You're good? You're good. You're good. You're good.
What are you following me for? That's straight vodka. Oh no, they're not. Oh, they're not.
So welcome to Whippersnapper Distillery. My name's Jens. I'll be your tour guide today. We make whiskey here from grains and cereals from around WA. Very proud of our WA grain heritage. Our story actually begins just over 10 years ago. We just celebrated our 10th anniversary not so long ago. My bosses, Jimmy and Al, they used to live next door to each other in Scarborough Beach around 2010, 2011. And they used to live next door to a man named Vic. Vic used to fly Lancaster bombers during the Second World War, and he used to make a moonshine for his bomber crew back in those days. It was the same moonshine that he was making in his backyard when Jimmy and Al met him as well. And Jimmy and Al completely fell in love with this still. It was a little 5-litre still. His moonshine was 100% corn, and it was about 86% ABV, so it was very strong stuff. But Jimmy and Al, they started experimenting with Vic's backyard still. Different mash bills, different age statements, barrel aging, that type of thing. And they wanted to grab his backyard still and upgrade it into what we're currently looking at today, which is our warehouse distillery. This place was first rented in 2011, so a couple of years after they'd met Vic. But they needed a whole bunch of investment to get this place off the ground, because you need a cool $500,000 to get something like this set up. And Jimmy and Al, they'd be uni students, they weren't exactly the wealthiest people out there. That, and they needed a whole bunch of information about how to run one of these places in terms of large-scale distillation. They'd been practicing a lot with Vic's backyard still, but this is a completely different ballgame. So they started travelling around the rest of the world, and that's when they, places like Scotland, Ireland, America, and that's when they ran into a man named Coop. And Coop was a master distiller at Colorado Gold Distillery in Colorado. He'd been making a bourbon-style corn-based whiskey for about 60 years at that stage. He couldn't call his whiskey bourbon because he wasn't in those ex-French territories in the US, so like Louisiana, Arkansas, these types of areas. But his recipe was very much the same as a bourbon-style whiskey, so he used virgin American white oak barrels, these ones over here. His mash bill was at least 50% corn. I think his was right up to 80%. And Coop helped us do our first few barrels here on site. He helped us set up our back still down the back end, the high combination skill. And he took Vic's recipe of 100% corn mash bill and he added about 10% wheat to add some thickness and viscosity to that whiskey. And he added about 10% barley to that mix as well to sort of help with sugar conversion. So that's really the story of how our upshot mash bill kind of came to be. That 80% corn, 10% wheat, 10% barley mash bill.
Okay.
And in today's tour, generally speaking, you'd be trying an unaged whiskey, which has come straight off the still, which is how whiskey starts, and then
Okay.
you'd be trying one that's 6 weeks in a barrel, and then one that's 2 years old. Naturally, this is a non-drinking tour, so we'll just be talking about the details concerning that barrel aging process. Frank comes in a little bit later when we started shoring off our bourbon-style whiskies to one side and started experimenting with single-grain whiskies, like malt barley, wheat. We now do a rye whiskey as well, and there's an unmalted barley whiskey coming out early next year.
Okay.
Frank had been working with Scotch for a really long time. I think he would be at Springbank Distillery for about 50 years. As the Scotch do, they only exclusively use malted barley to make Scotch whisky. Scotch whisky is defined by not only as it has to be made in Scotland to be called Scotch, it's got to be 100% malt barley, generally speaking, from one location, which is where the type of single malt really comes from. And they tend to use ex-bourbon casks as well, unlike Coop's recipe, which uses fresh casks every time. In fact, you can't use a second-hand cask to make a bourbon-style whiskey. You've got to have a fresh cask every time. Yeah. So Jimmy and Al, they're both country boys themselves. They actually grew up in rural WA. Jimmy himself's from Narrogin, which is sort of the capital of the wheat belt in WA. Al comes from Kununurra, which is way up north. And they both went to ag schools growing up. So these are high schools where you learn how to grow things, you learn how to look after animals, as well as the big four curricular subjects.
Okay.
Jimmy and Al had no interest in becoming a farmer whatsoever, but the people that supply our grains to us knew Jimmy and Al growing up. They've either inherited their own family farms or bought their own properties, and they stayed in touch. And they tend to deliver their grain to us personally.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Jimmy's down the back actually with his dog Copper. If you come down this way, I'll show you where we get our grains from. Just be aware of the uneven surfaces along the warehouse floor here. It's been rearranged quite a few times. So we're going to go right down the back.
This is cool. Jeez, where did he go? Oh, that way.
So this map was drawn up here by Jimmy many years ago now. But it basically shows you where we get our grains from. We get our wheat, barley and quinoa from Narrogin. We get our rye in from Bruce Rock, which is kind of on the way towards Kalgoorlie. And we get our corn from way up north in Kununurra.
That's so far.
Yeah.
The corn down there.
You need a nice tropical environment to grow lots of corn, generally speaking. There's actually a hectare of land in Kununurra in Jimmy's name, and he can experiment with different types of maize. So as you can see, we've been doing things with red corn and rainbow corn recently. Red corn was actually really famous. This won a global award as best corn whiskey in the world 2023.
Is it gonna taste different each corn? Or
Actually,
just...
it does, yeah. The difference in flavour is quite large. And they still taste sort of, a corn gives you a kind of oily texture and a nice sweet overtone for a spirit. And all of the different types of mazes tend to do that, but there are different types of sweetnesses, if that makes sense. The yellow corn tends to give you more of a kind of caramel toffee sort of sweetness when barrel aged. Red corn and rainbow corn tend to give you sort of more of a fairy flossy caster sugar type of sweetness. It's a slightly different type of flavour. All of our corn whiskies generally retain that 80% corn, 10% wheat barley mash bill, but you'll find that they're different corns a lot of the time. Red corn was so prolifically famous after it won the award that we don't have any of it anymore, unfortunately. We've got to wait for some to age, which will be ready in about a year and a half from now. Rainbow corn's readily available though, and that's a really nice drop as well. But we've got mountains and mountains of the upshot made with the yellow corn initially. So yeah, grains and cereals tend to be used by whiskey makers depending on what they've got in abundance. So in Scotland's case, it tends to be lots of malt barley or barley. In Ireland's case, it tends to be wheats and unmalted barleys. Sometimes you see oat in the Irish mash bill as well. No more than 10% usually. American whiskies tend to use lots of maize and corn, typically because they have lots and lots of it. They've also started experimenting many years ago with rye, which is a different type of grain entirely. Rye whiskey is quite prolifically famous in the US, gives you a really sort of black pepper finish, quite an oily type of texture as well, similar to corn. Wheat tends to be a bodybuilding grain. It adds thickness and viscosity to a mash bill. If you add so much as 10% wheat to a mash bill, you'd make it thicker and creamier on the tongue.
Oh, weird. Okay.
It also finishes on sort of honeycomby sugar canes aftertaste and flavours as well. Malt barley is of typical importance, not because of just the flavours that you get off of barley to make whiskey with, but inside barley contains alpha and beta amylase enzymes. And it's these enzymes that help us break down some of the more complex sugars, carbohydrates and starches in our other grains. See, yeast, the thing that we use to convert sugar to alcohol, only really likes simple fermentable sugars to work with. They don't like complex sugars like carbohydrates and starches. So the object at the moment is to try and process these grains and change all of their complex sugars into simple sugars before introducing the yeast to that mix. And the best way to do that is the first step really is to grist our grain. And by grist I mean basically making an almost flour-like consistency using this plate mill over here.
Oh.
So generally what we do is we get about 800 kilos of corn and we stick that in Jackie Chan. And Jackie Ma over there tends to get about 100 kilos of wheat and 100 kilos of barley. And you'll notice that all of our equipment have these strange names on them. And that's just sort of a traditional thing from COVID days. In 2020 and 2021, our still had to be run 24 hours a day to make sanitizer for hospitals because we were so short in sanitizer.
Oh.
And we were using pretty much everything from wine to beer to straight ethanol spirits, running it through our still and making sanitizer. But it meant people like myself who have got no training in distillation whatsoever would have to do runs, sometimes weird hours, 1, 2 in the morning in some cases. And that meant that our distillers would leave us long listed instructions with all of the names of our gear, just to make it easier for
Put
us to
something on
navigate.
Jackie Chan too.
Exactly. Yeah, Jackie Ma gets this, Jackie Chan gets this,
Yeah.
Jackie Wilson picks up the grist. That big plate weight sensor there was only about 4 years old. Before that, Jimmy was using a bathroom scale bucket like this to measure out 1 tonne of grain per mash. This has taken ages. Well, we all have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
Needless to say, Jimmy's ripped at the same time. Yeah. So for our upshot whiskey, which is our main flagship corn-based whiskey, that's the 80% corn, 10% wheat barley mash bill. We start gristing our corn, about 800 kilos of it, but we're going to keep it separate from our barley and wheat for now. And we'll take our grist over to our mash kettle, which is this thing over here.
That one.
Yeah, so take a look inside here. A mash kettle is, well, the easiest way to explain this is it's like a giant thermo mix, really. You get an agitator on the bottom that keeps grain moving around, and we'll get our 800 kilos of grist corn in here and fill this up with about 4,000 litres of water.
So it's like boiling it.
Yeah, pretty much. About 80 degrees, not quite a boil, but it's nearly there.
Oh.
So that sits in there for about 45 minutes, and that's called gelatinization, where you're basically softening up those carbohydrates and starches, making it much easier to manage when introducing our barley. But before we introduce our barley grist, which contains all of those enzymes, we have to drop our temperature first to about 64 degrees. We found it to be more efficient at a lower temperature to introduce our enzymes in grain. So once we get it to about 64 degrees, we start introducing our wheat and barley grist. And the barley contains all of those enzymes which will then break down a lot of the complex sugars and starches in our other grains, creating a mash. That usually takes another 45 minutes to an hour, and that's called saccharification. By the end of that stage, you have all of your sugars converted into simple fermentable sugars, ready for the introduction of yeast. We'll let this mixture cool down till about 32 degrees, which is that optimal fermentation temperature. Before casting it out the bottom end of that spout, using that green pipe behind you, and this little pump on wheels. Arnold, the pump on wheels, was handmade by Jimmy. A lot of the equipment here was handmade by Jimmy. Guy should really have been an engineer. So you'll notice a lot of this is held together with zip ties and duct tape. So come over here as we pump our goods from our mash kettle into our fermentation room. Here, this is where things get really interesting. These are 2,000 litre fermentation tanks. So one of those mash kettles fills up 2 of these tanks.
So it's open.
Yep, open top, grain in fermentation is what we do here. You can feel the heat come up with this as well. It's about 40 degrees at this point. So the yeast, once introduced to our mixture, will start consuming all of those sugars, and the yeast tends to produce carbon dioxide, which is what we're currently breathing in. If you guys feel a little bit lightheaded, just take a step outside. Shouldn't be too bad though.
Wow.
Sometimes if we've got 5 or 6 fermentations going at the same time, this room can get up to about 5 to 6,000 parts per million, and that's when we're really starting to feel that carbon dioxide. And that's what he's here to remember us, to remind us of.
Yeah.
That's cool.
But yeah, the other thing that the yeast will produce is lots of heat. A lot of people ask me if we introduce heat to this at all. It's not. This is all the yeast doing its thing.
It just kind of like it's cooking.
Pretty
but
much,
without,
yeah.
without,
Chemical
without
cook,
heat,
really.
isn't it?
Yeah. And naturally, the other thing that it produces, other than heat and carbon dioxide, is about 4 different types of alkaloid. So after 5 days of sitting inside this tank with the yeast, you usually end up with about 6 to 8% alcohol, which is about the strength of the beer. In fact, making beer and whiskey at this stage is almost exactly the same practice. If I were to use, let's say, lots of wheat and barley to make this mixture, and then I added hops and filtrated it a few days after the fact, it would in fact be a beer. But instead what we're going to do is we're going to grab our mash and transport it into our still, where we extract the pure alcohol from that mixture using distillation. There's nothing particularly special about the type of yeast that we use here. We just use a regular distiller's yeast that has a really high temperature window. I think it's between 12 and 48 degrees. And it has a high alcoholic yield as well. And yeah, this is known as grain-in open-top fermentation. Open-top's pretty self-explanatory. We don't mind it too much if bugs and birds end up in our mixture. Added bacterium and flavour helps the fermentation process along. Besides, once we get down to our still section, most of that gets, in fact, all of that gets extracted out as part of the process anyway. Hey, that's just the guy picking up our spent grains. So yeah, after day 5, generally this process stopped on its own, as the yeast will run out of sugar and they'll just die off naturally. So this thing cools down and you'll be left behind with about 6 to 8% alcohol, in which case we simply cart it from the same end using Arnold, the pump on wheels, same way that we got it into this tank in the first place, and we'll push it into our hybrid still, which is around the corner here.
So how do you know if the, what you call it, like the sugar is ready to be?
Great question. So what we do is what's called a grading test, where we take a scoop of our mash from the beginning and the end of our fermentation. And generally we get a sucrose count that's quite high to start with, and by the end of the yeast doing its thing, we'll end up with 0 sucrose, which is how you know that they've converted all of that to alcohol basically.
I was like wondering, how do you know? Is it like it's always 5 days, or you just like?
Well, with our upshot production, it's generally 5 days on the dot, mainly because we've done it so many times over.
Ah, okay,
But
so it's always 5
depending on what
days.
kind of grains we've got in there, it could be 7 days.
Okay.
With our single malt, it takes a bit longer, for example. But with upshot, it's almost consistently 5 days. But yeah, for record's sake, we'll actually do a gravity test before and after a fermentation, just to make sure our sugar conversion's happened as it should.
Yeah.
Not that we've ever had a problem with that before.
Yep. Because when I see like the thing, it looks like they look the same.
Yeah.
Even though.
Leave it open. Yeah. Alright, so this here is our combination still. Okay, it's called a hybrid combination still because you've got 2 different types of stills. The first one on your left is called the Scotch pot. You need one of these to make Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey, Canadian pot still whiskey. Anything with the word pot in it, you need one of these things. And what this does is does our stripping run, which is the first type of distillation, where you're using hot vapor to extract alcohol from a mixture. So we'll have our mash hot inside here. That's the grain, the water, everything that's inside of it. And we'll start pushing vapor using this green pipe at the bottom and the top. And that vapor sits at about 80 degrees. The boiling point of alcohol is 78 degrees Celsius. So what the vapor does is it picks up the alcohol and then condenses it back into a liquid up the top end.
Okay.
Before guiding it into our second type of still, which is over here, which is called an American column. The American column, or this American column, does a little bit more of our stripping run for us. You can see through here that it's a much smaller sized contained system than our Scottish pot. You've got
Okay.
The vapor that comes through the back end that evaporates the alcohol, and then that goes up, and then you've got this little copper cone here that condenses our vapor back into a liquid before it hits another element and gets evaporated again. And then there's another copper cone up here that condenses it back into a liquid. So after our stripping run, we usually end up with about 60% ABV. And it smells a bit like this. You smell that?
You go first.
So it smells quite grainy still, like a bit like nail polish.
Yeah, it's kind of like an alcohol nail polish.
Yeah, super alcoholic nail polish. So most distillers at this stage will then start what's called a rectification run, where you clean your whiskey. You're removing all of the heavier compounds and molecules, and we use our second column still for that, which contains 16 bubble plates. Rather than using a hot vapor to extract alcohol from a liquid, what we're doing here is just boiling and condensing that same liquid over and over again. And every time you do that, all of the heavier molecules and compounds will get trapped inside this copper plate. So every time you recondense that vapor back into a liquid, it's a much more pure kind of form of spirit. What you end up with by the end of that process, which is a further 16 times over distilled. So right now we're sitting at 20 times distilled,
Okay.
and it smells a bit like that, which is much cleaner. You get a little bit of the alcoholic evaporation,
Yeah.
but it's not as grainy anymore.
Smells like a very
That's
alcohol, like very strong.
That smells good.
We're looking at 90% here, so
Oh, that's 90%.
very, very
okay.
strong.
That smells nice.
And what happens then is it ends up in our final column, this condenser column here. And while it sits in that condenser column, it'll split into what are called 3 different cuts. The first cut will be all of the heavier material that'll end up at the bottom. And then the middle section of this column, about 70% of it, will contain what's called the hearts, and that's got all of your ethanol in it. That's the stuff that you want. And then at the top, you've got all your lighter material, which is known as tails, which contains all of your oils and things. So the first thing that comes off of the still generally is your heads, which is all the heavier material, and that contains a lot of methanol, butyl alcohols, acetones and things like that. Very, very bad for you. Moonshiners back in the day, or during Prohibition, people used to poison themselves by accident. It was purely because they were not making these cuts properly. They were accidentally drinking methanol, and that stuff's very, very bad for you. So what we do is we use this little indicator here called the spirit parrot, which gives us a running percentage of alcohol, and we compare that percentage to the line mark temperature.
Okay.
And the boys know when to make these cuts. They know exactly when our methanol has come straight through this tap and into this jug, and we've then accessed that middle section of that column, the hearts. We simply turn that tap off, and that re-guides our ethanol into this tank here at 90%. And we usually let that run for a while until the colour of our liquid begins to change, and that's when it starts to go sort of yellowy brown. And that's when you know that you've reached your tails, which contains all of your oils. Tails aren't necessarily bad. We just didn't like the flavours that we got off of it, so we tend not to use them.
Okay.
But if I were making a different type of spirit, for example, with rum, I might go right into those tails, because that's where rum makers are convinced that's where the flavour is. But like I said, for our whiskey, we're just here for our ethanol, that middle section, the hearts, and that sits inside this tank at about 90%, where most distillers will then cut their spirits back to about 40 to 45 before either bottling or barrel aging it. And they just tend to use water, local water, so it's glacial ice water, limestone deposit water, whatever they've got locally, really.
So not tap water.
No.
Okay.
Not
God.
generally, anyway. Not unless they're connected straight to a reservoir. Like you see that sometimes in Scotland.
Okay.
Yeah, we tried using local water here. Unfortunately, our water is so mineral rich, it ended up actually ruining the flavour of our whiskey. So what we do is we use rectification. They use reverse osmosis filters. There's a couple of filters down there, and there's a couple of filters at the front of the distillery as well. And it basically gives us a flavourless and odourless water that only cuts our alcohol content to about 40%. And then at that stage, you end up with Crazy Uncle Moonshine.
Oh, okay. So,
Crazy Uncle Moonshine was first released in 2014, and all whiskey starts out as a clear spirit. That was a huge shock to me when I first started working here.
Yeah, I only figured that out last week myself.
okay.
It actually gets its colour and flavour primarily, or about 60% of its flavour, I should say, from the barrel aging process. At this stage, it's pretty similar to a vodka or a gin. It's just not having it doesn't have any juniper berry or botanicals in it, so we can't call it a gin. And it's the wrong grain type to be called a vodka. So we use the term moonshine because we use a corn majority mash bill here.
So it's once it goes in the barrel, adds the colour, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, once
Yep.
it's been sitting in for like 4 or
okay.
5 years, or how long does it take roughly to get colour if it's in a
Not very
barrel?
long at all.
Like a year or
No, even
not
less
even
than that.
6
Actually, we
months?
get about 6 weeks. We
Oh,
get
really?
some colour. You get
Wow.
a yellow one. Actually, I'll show you the bottle of it later.
Okay.
But there's a barrel-aged moonshine that we do that's pretty much immediately tasting and looking like a whiskey.
Wow.
We just can't call it one because the minimum criteria in Australia is 2 years at a barrel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you guys are in luck because we've actually got this set up over here. Jimmy had just left these. He was about to bung these barrels. Ready to bung some barrels?
Yeah, who wants to do it?
Jane,
You
you're up
know
first.
Why?
These
I'm
are
gonna
freshly filled.
I'm gonna mess it up.
It's pretty easy. It's pretty big to hit.
Oh, you want me to
and
go
all you're
first
gonna
then?
get around there. So
Just bang it in.
you just gotta whack it nice and hard.
Yeah, you go first then, mate. Beautiful.
That's good.
Bit of stress relief for you then. You don't take that then? I'll do the
See
next
if you
one.
can get it in one hit. That's the challenge for you.
Just bang it in, that's it.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
I wasn't sure how hard to hit. I didn't want to go right through it. So. Awesome. Thank you. That was cool.
All right, so come around these way, guys, and we'll talk about what's happening inside those barrels. Barrel aging is actually a really interesting process.
You did get footage of me whacking that, right? Okay.
So we get our barrels in from Missouri. It's one of the largest oak reservoirs in the world. They can grow a tree in about 60 years, and then they cut it into stakes like this, or they let those stakes dry out for about 18 months. They'll then assemble the barrel in water using iron rings to keep it in shape before charcoaling the inside of it, basically with a giant Bunsen burner. There are 4 different levels of charcoaling, and each one gives you a slightly different flavour set. So the light charcoalings, what we call a light toasting, tend to be used by the wine industry a lot because they give you a really nice sort of vanilla-roid creamy flavour that comes out.
Okay.
The darker charcoal, the alligator skin charcoaling at level 4, tends to give you a really deep kind of burnt sugar, toffee sort of esque kind of flavour. And we use level 3 because it has a really nice caramel centre. There's an element of that vanilla and an element of the toffee as well.
Okay.
But pretty much what you're doing when you're charcoaling the inside of the barrel is you're drawing all of the wood sugars to the surface, the inside of the barrel, and then caramelizing them. So sitting behind what you've created is a type of carbon filter, I guess. As your spirit is gliding in and out of that carbon filter, the heavier molecules and compounds get trapped in that carbon, and as a result it cleans your whiskey or sweetens it up slightly. Sitting behind that charcoal layer though, it's a whole bunch of wood sugar that you've caramelized into a sort of toffee, and you can kind of see this leaking out of some of our casks. So these types of things is what's known as a weeping cask. A lot of people ask me if this is whiskey leaking out of the barrel. It's actually not. It's that wood sugar that you're pushing out. That's just how much of an airtight seal you've got inside these casks. And you can break this off and eat it.
What?
Yeah, try that.
So this is
That's that wood sugar that you've caramelized. Basically, it tastes a lot like caramel with a very strong oaky flavour.
I'm like,
bitter though. Yay. It is sugary but bitter.
Yeah.
Like a cough medicine.
So pretty much what's happening inside our barrel is we fill it up to the brim, and alcohol is quite a volatile liquid. As the day increases in temperature, your alcohol will start to expand as it increases in temperature, and it will get right into that wood. It will get past that carbon filter. It'll mix with that toffee layer that's sitting behind that carbon filter, and as your day cools off, the alcohol will contract and go straight back towards the centre, and it will pull all of that colour and flavour towards the centre. So you've got this sort of in and out motion happening. The more volatile the climate, the quicker that action is. So in Australia's case, that's why we have a 2-year rule as opposed to Scotland's 3-year rule.
it's because of the heat. Nice. nice.
It's really about differential. Scotland's cold and wet all year. They usually get somewhere between 3 and 5 degrees between minimum and maximum temperatures. Whereas in Australia, during summer, for example, it's like 15 to 20 degrees. There's a lot of volatility in that climate.
Yeah.
And as a result, we age things much, much quicker.
Well, that's
And
a
like
good
we
advantage for us, isn't it?
Yeah, to a certain extent. There are drawbacks to this, though. That there is a 6-week barrel-aged moonshine, so it really doesn't take very long for that colour and flavour to impart itself on our whiskey. And you'll immediately pick up the caramel, toffee, vanilla-roid notes on the nose and in flavour. Still, we can't call that a whiskey yet. It needs to be in a barrel for at least 2 years to do that. So, one of the drawbacks of actually having a really fast aging process is the angel share. Have you guys heard of this expression? Angel share describes liquid evaporating inside the barrel. It's an old French expression for when they were making cognac. They realised that after cracking a barrel at 3 years, they had less liquid in the barrel than when they started with, and they were convinced that the angels were simply taking a share of that mixture. Usually, in places like Europe, you'd end up with an evaporation rate of somewhere between 3 and 5% per barrel. And that leaves behind a slightly more alcoholic and a slightly richer flavoured solution. But in Australia, because we have a really rapid aging process, we actually look at somewhere between 9 and 12% evaporation, which is no small amount of whiskey, especially when you're looking at a 200-litre cask. Best example of evaporation that I can point at would be this 9-year-old whiskey here. You'll notice that the 9-year-old whiskey, this is a 2-year-old, much, much darker, and a result of that is because not only has it been sitting in that barrel for a really, really long time comparatively to the 2-year, but there's also much less liquid inside that barrel as well. The 9-year-old barrel that we cracked open, we got 165 bottles out of a barrel. Usually I get about 230, 240. So we lost about 60 bottles of whiskey to angel share in that case. And this is often why you don't see very age statementy whiskey in Australia. After 15 to 20 years, there's going to be nothing left in that
Just
barrel.
gone.
Yeah.
All the liquid gone
And it will be
already.
very, very expensive and almost not marketable as a result.
Yeah.
So trying to convince people that that 9-year is essentially equivalent to a 21-year-old Scotch, it's quite hard. But once they try it, they understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, because like the process of like the heating up and everything is already like the fast process.
Yes,
anyway.
really, really fast. But like I said, drawbacks of that is angel share is much, much larger.
I love this bottle here. It's so beautiful, the label on it.
The rainbow corn bottle, yeah
Yeah,
quite
that's
cool.
so cool. I've never seen a label like that. It's really nice.
This was released about 4 or 5 months ago now.
Yep.
It just missed this year's competitions. We'll enter it in next year's competition. Hopefully it does well.
What's the percentage alcohol in that one?
43.
43,
So for our upshot,
nice.
we tend to keep it consistent at 43%, 80% corn, 10% wheat barley. But in that case, naturally, we've used rainbow corn rather than yellow corn.
That's cool. I might get that one for the bar today. You got all of these available for sale?
Absolutely, yeah. We can
Sweet.
definitely try extra stuff in the cellar door.
Cool.
We do bottle sales there as well.
Excellent.
So the next thing I was talking about with barrel aging is use of second-hand barrels, because what we do here is what's called a single barrel whiskey, and you'll see that written on a lot of our bottles, single barrel whiskey, and you'll even have the number of the barrel that it came from. And this is an important part of single barrel whiskey. If I put a barrel down in winter and a barrel down in summer, after 2 years they actually see radically different climates from each other, and as a result their flavours will change slightly. Yes, it'll taste like Upshot, and Jimmy will make sure that it hits the mark of that vanilla-roid, caramel centre and toffee finish. But Barrel 247 might have a bit more of a vanilla-roid overtone. Barrel 248 might have a bit more of a caramelly centre. Each barrel is going to have its own character as a result of it seeing a different climate than the next barrel. And we're talking about minute differences here as well. See these wall of barrels behind you? The barrels closest toward us are actually getting more light exposure than the ones back towards the wall. The ones back towards the brick wall are getting cold air that's coming off of that brick wall. So there's a temperature disparity between these two.
Yeah.
So even in this case, if I put the barrels down at exactly the same time of year, I would still end up with 2 different flavours. And this is part of the art process of making whiskey. It's a marriage of art and science. There's only so much you can plan for.
So if like when you open the barrel, you obviously need to taste one. If
Yeah, so to make sure that it's all exactly the way it should be.
Yeah.
But a lot of our customers understand that each barrel is going to be slightly different than the next.
So it was okay like that.
Basically, larger scale distilleries will grab all of these barrels and then homogenize it into one giant vat and make sure that there's a chemical engineer that makes sure it's exactly the flavour and colour that they want before doing 500,000 bottles or something. And that's just a different style of business. For them, it's more about consistency, so that Joe Bloggs can go to the bottle and buy that same bottle of whiskey for $60, have the same experience every time. With us, it's a lot more artisanal. A lot of people like to describe us as a small, like micro brew instead of a distill. So it's micro distilling.
How do they keep the consistency of like the taste? Is it like they have to do exactly the same every time, but then how? It's like temperature changes.
Yeah,
and then
a lot of the
like,
time it's what's called a post-barrel marry, where you end up with all of those barrels being stuck in one tank, and they'll get a chemical engineer out to make sure it's exactly what they want. A lot of the time, when you get that sort of ethanol burn finish for a whiskey, it means that they've changed the pH and ABV post taking it out of the barrel to get it right. Which is why a lot of our whiskies are a lot smoother. While each barrel will taste slightly different, you end up with a far less like an ethanol burn.
like what I know is like whiskey comes from a cold America. Yeah, and then when my husband said like, oh, there is one in Australia, it's like,
Yeah, it's a different ball game here when aging whiskey, but yeah, we use an American style blueprint at least initially, but we have branched into some Scotch recently. So we've got our single malt here, and the rules with Scotch whiskey is that you have to use an ex-bourbon cask to age it in. The reason they do this is because they've spent all of this time isolating flavours and distillates when fermentation, and I guess they don't want a barrel to then overpower those flavours that they've isolated in fermentation and distillation. So they kind of like a used tea bag. They like a barrel that's been stripped once already. Hence why they use second-hand barrels. So while this is a 4-year-old whiskey, you'll notice that it's not as dark as some of our upshot is, even though the upshot's half the age statement of these single malts. A lot of the time, Scotch whiskey, while it's been in a barrel for a really long time, because they use second-hand barrels, they don't tend to get too much of a colour disparity. And it means that they don't overpower these fruitier notes that they can sometimes get. And our single malt whiskies, no exception. It's quite fruity. So we also hand out our second-hand barrels to wineries, brewers, and other distillers who tend to use them, whether they're making Scotch whiskey or whether they're making red wine using bourbon casks and things like that. We've also been commissioned a couple times from various brewers, so Blaster Brewing from, I think we're in East Victoria now. They commissioned us to age some of their stout in our ex-bourbon casks. So that stout's going to get right into that wood. It's going to pick up a little bit of the bourbon that's still locked in that wood. And it's going to flavour that stout over time. And we'll do the same with wine casks as well. You see the Olorosos up here? Oloroso is a fruity type of sherry. And we've got those in from the Perth Hills. I can't remember which winery off the top of my head now. But they took some ex-upshot casks from us, so they'll be using those to age some of their sherry and wine, and we're using some of their ex-sherry casks to age in whiskey. So those particularly will have a wheat, single malt, a rye, and an upshot, all done and finished in sherry casks. Something we've done before is a Pedro Jimenez, which is this one. Pedro Jimenez is just a very sweet type of sherry. We've got a couple of really big casks down there from the Perth Hills. We've been using it to age our upshot as well. This particular one was done from scratch though, so it was a white spirit and then it became a whiskey, just in a sherry cask on its own. So it's got a sort of reddish tone to it as a result, you'll notice when I compare it to this.
Yeah.
And it has a sort of black foresty fruity finish, which is really the sherry talking. Using pre-seasoned casks is what this is known as, and it's becoming quite popular in Australia. You'll find a lot of distillers are using PX and Oloroso casks to finish their whiskies. Give it a bit of an extra layer of complexity. In fact, some of the major award winners this year with the World Whisky Awards were PX sherry cask finishes as well. So like I said, when Frank kind of introduced himself to us from Scotland, we started branching into single grain whiskey. So we've now got the wheat whiskey, which is 100% wheat from Narrogin. Single malt, which is the Spartacus variant of malt barley we get from Narrogin as well. The rye is 100% rye. We get that from Bruce Rock. fact, the guys that actually deliver that rye have been growing that same early rye for about 130 years. They moved here from Bavaria in 1911. Took the rye with them. Been growing it ever since.
Wow.
The rum, on the other hand, is a bit different. We started doing that about a year and a half ago, and that is a 60% molasses, 40% raw sugar mash bill. So rum is defined by sugar and molasses being used to make spirits.
Okay.
Whereas whiskey is just a cereal or a grain, and barrel aged as well.
Wow.
Yeah, do you guys have any questions regarding barrel aging?
No, not really.
At the moment, so
I'm just so glad we came here. This is so much good information. I'm impressed.
just like you said, the barrel is an oak tree, isn't it?
Yeah,
Like,
white American oak specifically. Yeah.
and you actually use another tree that is kind of like the same strength kind of wood or something?
Yeah,
or?
great question. So there are other woods that can be used. It tends to be that a lot of people started using woods other than American oak during the interwar period in the 1920s and 30s, and it was mainly because America had slapped embargoes on everybody, kind of like what they're doing today, weirdly enough.
With the tariffs.
Yeah, so everyone couldn't get their hands on white oak for a while. That's why the Japanese started using Mizunara casks. And that's why Australia used red gum casks for a little while. But generally speaking, we try not to use eucalypt, mainly because eucalypt's actually toxic. If you make barrels with it, you can make people quite sick, which is not great. That and the flavours that you get off of it aren't too great either. White oak tends to typically be used a lot because you can use about 85% of the tree because it doesn't knot very much, which means you can make a lot of barrels out of the one tree. The other thing is it's very rich sugar. So when you charcoal the inside of it, you get these very typical flavours like caramel, toffee, vanilla. There are other types of oak that are often used, like French oak tends to get used quite a lot in Europe. Hungarian oak I've seen used a lot as well, and they just give you a slightly different flavour profile. Very similar in flavour with the caramel centres, but the Hungarian oak tends to give you a little bit more of a sort of charcoaly sea salt aftertaste and flavour, and the French oak tends to be heavy emphasis on that vanilloid notes, which is why they're typically used for wine. Winemakers really like the fact that the vanilloid notes take back a lot of the heavy tannins in red wine. So they'll stick it in a barrel for like 9-10 months, no more.
Because like before, I was always thinking like, oh, maybe they can just like pick any kind of tree, make barrel.
You probably could. The thing then would be, if the wood is not porous enough, you won't be able to get a watertight seal going, so your barrel will leak, which is not great. The other thing is that if the wood doesn't have enough wood sugar in it to caramelize, when you actually go to charcoal the inside of the barrel, you'd end up with not so much a caramel toffee flavour coming out of it, just a really barky, oaky flavour, which is not ideal.
Yeah, the taste gonna be like slightly bitter, I
Yep,
guess.
absolutely.
Just instead
Yeah.
of sweet, it's just gonna be slightly bitter. Oh, okay. That's good to know.
Yeah.
No, I learned.
Yeah, I learnt a lot today. Yeah, I thought it's good to have a bit more knowledge on what I'm selling, so today's been amazing.
I'm working as a chef as well. This is new information.
So yeah, what we're doing here is hydrating barrels. So we'll get them in dry, wrapped in plastic like this, and we'll tip them on their side and then just fill them with water. And when the barrel stops leaking, you know that it's created a watertight seal. So you just empty it of the water and stick your distillate in there.
Okay. And then if you do like a second hand barrel, do you actually rinse the inside first or just
No,
like
we can leave it
there?
as is, yeah.
Oh,
Because what's
okay.
in that barrel after second-hand use is a lot of the whiskey that was in there prior will be locked in that wood. It's called Devil's Cut, and that's what's flavouring the next thing that you stick in there after the fact.
Okay. Okay. I just feel like rolling.
Yeah, that tends to be how it goes here, actually. We get the barrels delivered once a year, and the last time that happened was a couple of months ago now. It's a barrel rodeo, we call it, where we get a big shipping container dropped out the front, and we have to roll in about 210 barrels as quick as we can to get the shipping container out the way.
Oh shit.
You get pretty sore after doing something like that, yeah?
Usually beer's flying around and everyone's having a good time though, so
Yeah.
it's a bit of a team building exercise these days.
Is it more in the forearms or everything? Back, legs?
It's a bit of everything.
Everything,
really,
yeah.
'cause you end up having to move these things around quite a lot
Yeah.
by hand.
Yeah.
We do have the one pallet jack, but it's not, it's not ideal when you've got more than 100 barrels coming.
Yeah.
For one barrel, what's the weight? Like,
Great
roughly?
question. I wouldn't be able to tell you off the top of my head, but it's not light.
Or an empty barrel? Or,
Yeah, the empty
Even
barrel.
the empty ones are quite heavy still. You can roll them pretty easily. I actually find if the barrel's full, it's easier to roll, and I think it's because there's more
Momentum.
weight being pushed around, so there's
Yeah.
more like a centrifugal force.
Yeah.
But yeah, lifting them, like getting them on their side, that's
Yeah.
quite hard.
Because like if you put it sideways like this, eventually you need to put it out.
Yeah, actually, yeah. Well, generally what happens is Jimmy will just use that forklift. We get the
Okay.
forks to come in, and then you can have a barrel suspended in the middle, and they're really good at doing that.
Okay.
I don't think we've ever had a cask dropped once, which is kind of crazy if you think about it, given how many we're eating.
Hmm.
Yes.
So I get a lot of the questions about what's the difference between having them on their
Yeah.
on their back and on their side. It's actually really not a whole lot of difference, really. When you're looking at barrel aging statements, these ones in particular will be going for about 2 years, and we're finding that the level of evaporation you get after 2 years really doesn't affect it too much. Anything more than that, though, you ideally want to have them on their side like this. You'll notice that that big one there, barrel 14 of the rye, had a split open face.
Hmm.
That was a bit tragic. We had a particularly cold July a couple of years ago. It was all of a sudden just very cold, and I don't think they hydrated the front end of that barrel properly, and as a result it dried out and began to leak. After a while it stopped leaking naturally, but we did lose quite a bit of rye out of that barrel. And that just means that that rye has now got a little bit more air inside the cask, which will produce more oxygenization of that particular whiskey. And it will affect the overall aging process. So that'll be a particularly interesting rye. Rye 14. Pretty excited about that one.
So make it better or worse, do you think?
Depends really. I mean,
Okay.
it's a bit of a dice roll when you're doing
So
things like that.
It's gonna
Yeah.
be like a 50-50 chance whether
Yeah,
it's gonna
I mean,
go
it
bad
could be
or
great
it's
or it
gonna
could be good. If it's bad, Jimmy might end up blending it into something else.
Yeah.
So we don't have a waste products here. We just end up finding a use for it somewhere.
This is turning into
But
like
from
a
what he's
test
told
subject.
me, it won't be bad. It'll just be different.
Hmm.
It might have a bit more of a caramel center, I guess.
Okay.
Cool.
At least that's kind of like that one barrel gonna be like a test subject. It's like, oh, if something like this happen again, at least we know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of our barrels started out as these little 5-litre casks. Once upon a time, we used to use these 75-litre ones as well. So we've been slowly upgrading the size of cask that we use. But with the smaller barrel, you can get an aged product much quicker than you can in a bigger one because of the surface area difference.
Okay.
So what we do is we do small experiments in these, and then if we like what we got, we'll just upgrade the recipe to one of the bigger casks.
Cool.
All of our recipes started out that way.
Okay. Oh, so this is the inside.
Look at the barrel up there.
Mm.
I kind of want to break that bit off now.
Yeah, there's something hanging on it.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Anyway, guys, it kind of brings us to the end of that tour.
Yeah. I didn't see that barrel there.
Yeah. The inside of the barrel.
Yeah, I like him because it shows you that they do the inside of the actual face of the barrel as well. So everything from top to bottom is charcoaled on these things. Sometimes you'll even see ones that are charcoaled on the outside as well, and that just helps critters not get in there. I had a guy yesterday that came in from New Zealand. He was saying that he had some critters that actually burrowed their way into his barrels, ruined his whiskey.
Oh no.
It's tragic. I was like, right, you need to get the double-sided charcoal barrels
Yeah.
because that stops that from happening pretty much.
So you don't ever spray it with pesticides.
Could
or
do,
anything?
but then you worry about
Affecting
contamination and stuff.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Because wood's quite porous. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, the other option that you can go with is you do you grab one of those steel container drum things,
Yep.
and then a lot of people will use charcoal wood chips, and then they'll throw that in there with their distiller, and that kind of gives you that natural aging process without having to use a barrel. Yeah, the leaves get blown in here pretty much every day. It's those plane trees out the front, they're terrible. Alrighty guys, let's come through the cellar door.
Oh.